Welcome back to the Changemaker Podcast. I'm your host, Deke Copenhaver. My guest today is Joshua Freedman, the co-founder and CEO of 6 Seconds, the Emotional Intelligence Network. Joshua is one of the world's top experts on developing emotional intelligence to improve performance. At the Heart of Leadership is an international bestseller, is his second book, and now in its fourth edition. He's also the author of 6 validated psychometric assessments and hundreds of articles and papers. So, Joshua, thank you for being here today.
Welcome to the Changemaker Podcast, hosted by Deke Copenhaver. Deke is the author of The Changemaker, a Forbes publishing book that has reached #1 on Amazon on multiple occasions and in multiple categories like management skills and total quality management. During this podcast, Deke interviews exceptional change-making leaders. Deke currently operates Copenhaver Consulting, where he helps local governments and other public organizations maximize their potential. He's also a sought-after public speaker. We hope that the Changemaker has an impact on you today and that you find takeaways that make you a better leader in your life. Now, here's Deke.
I would go on, but as I say, you're going to have to carry the show today because my voice is going south. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Deke. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Joshua, I want to ask you, because we had a great conversation recently, and I feel like we're kindred spirits, but so emotional intelligence now is such a hot topic. It seems like, people want to talk about it, but you were really there at the forefront of this. And so how does a nice
I was country when country wasn't
cool. Yeah, you
cool.
were country when country wasn't cool. But how does a nice young man born in Berkeley, California, end up becoming a world-renowned expert in emotional intelligence, EQ?
Well, Deke, the short answer is they dragged me kicking and screaming into it. I think we teach what we most need to learn.
Yep.
And when we started 6 Seconds, my job was going to be kind of backstage. I was in charge of products and the business. And one of my co-founders, the president, Annabelle Jensen, who's super emotionally intelligent, was in charge of the content. And then we started getting inquiries from all over the place. And Annabelle at the time was a professor. And she said, "Oh, Josh, I can't take more time off my class. You have to go do this one." Now, look, wait. I have to go teach this class. That's not my job. And she's like, "No, you'll do great." And I think, like a lot of mentors, she saw something in me that I didn't see in myself.
Yeah.
But the origin story is there was a school where I was a teacher. Annabelle was the executive director. And when Dan Goleman wrote his book in 1995, he talked about our program at the school as one of the 2 models he'd seen in the world of how you actually develop and use emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And so we started to get a lot of inquiries from people saying, I love this book. The theory is so interesting, but it doesn't tell you how. So how do you actually do this? And in 1997, we actually had a really horrible conflict in the school, and there was a lot of struggle, and it was extremely painful. And trying to redeem that and turn that pain into something, we decided to start an organization to really focus on emotional intelligence. And we said, we're gonna go answer that question of how.
Mm-hmm.
How do you actually turn this into something valuable? Not just something to know, but something to use, something to be.
And so now you're working all over the world. You're teaching people this. You've got such an amazing network of people you've connected with. But to me, and I'd like to tell people this because I'm very into, connecting, but this is not just touchy-feely stuff. This adds value to the bottom line of your business. You've got clients like FedEx, Intel, Amazon, Microsoft that have engaged you to help with their efforts. So talk a little bit about that, because I think so often people are like, oh, emotional intelligence, that's just touchy-feely stuff, and it's not that at all.
So we've worked for the last 25 years to help both document from a research perspective, but also demonstrate in the real world how these skills, how this awareness increases value. And whether that's more people living in a healthcare situation, more students loving learning in an education situation, more profitability and performance in business, more trust and alignment and integrity in government. Like whatever the value that we're looking for, we've attempted to document this, and we've seen over and over and over again, from NFL athletes to tech to industry to healthcare, as I said, government and education. Mm-hmm. It's not that hard to connect the dots.
Yeah,
it's not so easy to really grow this kind of culture, but you mentioned that there's this growing awareness, this growing interest in emotional intelligence, I think in part because there's so much emotional turmoil that people are dealing with. And in that state of emotional turmoil, we can see more clearly than ever before how when there is distress and distrust, we lose people's energy.
Yeah.
We lose communication. We lose alignment. We lose the assurance of quality. We lose the relationship with customers. We lose the sense that we can try something new quickly. And we spend more and more time in CYA, cover your derriere, and, more kind of retracting into self-interest. Mm-hmm. And I think from the perspective of being an organizational leader or a community leader, or hopefully both, we need people to be kind of feeling that sense of capacity and strength and connectedness, and that they are part of this larger story and that their full energy can come forward. And when you do that, you have less errors, you have less waste, you have more productivity, more innovation, you have faster cycle times, you have better customer relationships, you have better retention of good employees. And you just have more, it's like oil in the engine. People just work together more smoothly.
It's interesting. I always have focused on connecting with the younger generation because I get inspiration and energy from them. But when you look at, like, say, Generation Z, I mean, these core values and social responsibility and compassion, those are in their DNA. Not that they're not in every generation, but I've shared with people that, you need to be an employer of choice. And so you need to create cultures where people want to work. Mm-hmm. And particularly for the younger generations, I think it's, they are quickly, the end of that generation, Generation Z, is not going to hit voting age until 2030. So if you're ignoring that generation, that's the wrong answer from a business perspective or even from a political perspective.
Yeah. I think that the generational differences are real. We're just working on analysis on one of our studies, which is the world's largest study of emotional intelligence. And we've been every couple of years releasing a new report. Our last report showed that the early part of the pandemic was really devastating in terms of emotional intelligence and well-being, and particularly devastating in terms of the sense of connectedness that younger people were feeling. We're seeing now that basically every generation was adversely affected.
Yeah.
But the younger you are, the more adversely you were affected by the last 3 years. And so, not that you and I are old, but at this age, we have other kinds of stability, and it's like, okay, well, I got to work at home. That's all right. I can figure that out. Whereas my son, who's 21, was just dying to get out of the house. And you could just viscerally see how the kind of restriction of those early pandemic years was a real struggle for him.
Yeah.
Magnify that by millions of people. And this is a study in 140 countries. And so we're seeing this global shift. And I think that the bad news is this is also not in our data, but like the CDC just published new data about adolescent mental health.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a really serious crisis that we're facing all over the world that is an emotional crisis.
Well, and that's in some research I was doing for a blog I did for Forbes a couple years back. In the US, in Europe, in Australia, worldwide, I believe it was from a mental health perspective, the most impacted age range was 18 to 25. And that's, as you say, that's not going to go away. I mean, that's a point in time, but these young people are going to have issues to deal with, some of them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and I hear employers say things like, "Oh, these fragile flowers," and
Yeah.
that's super judgmental. And at the same time, I can understand the struggle when you are somebody who hasn't really faced these challenges. Maybe you don't understand. And as somebody running an organization, you are going to be having employees with a higher level of distress coming into your door tomorrow than you did a year ago, than you did 5 years ago.
Yep.
And if you're not taking responsibility for that distress, you are, I don't think you're being ethical as a leader. But in addition to that, you are going to be wasting a lot of money.
Yep. Well, it's interesting. I started a new book last month, and actually I've included you in it, just based on our conversation recently. But we talked about how you make moral judgments. It can happen from generation to generation. Every generation has been termed lazy by their elders. Let's just get that out of the way. You and I are Generation X, shoegazers, grunge rockers, which I do like grunge, and no doubt Nirvana. Today is actually Kurt Cobain's birthday, by the way. But we make those moral pronouncements. But as you said, you told me you traveled the world with your wife and children to give your children exposure to other cultures. And sometimes I think it's not that a different culture or a different generation is bad or wrong. It's just different, and being different's okay.
I think that this phrase, is it wrong or is it different?
Yeah.
Was a very big part of those schooling years for us. It was homeschool, but we called it airplane school because I was traveling a lot for my work, and we thought, you know what, this is really an incredible opportunity. Our kids are 8 and 10 years old. Let's just go out in the world instead of me leaving everyone. Let's get out in the world, and we would take these 3-month-long trips, say around Asia, for example. And I would be doing work in Singapore, and then we would go to Borneo and study the rainforest. And then we'd go to China and I'd work, and then we would go somewhere and eat dim sum. And so it was really a fantastic learning experience for all of us. And but one of our other phrases that we had as a family was embrace the taste. Right? Like, oh, this is weird. Embrace the taste. Like, let's just try it and really see what this different thing is. And then we can assess whether that fits for us or not. What I'd say, Deke, is that from a neurobiological perspective, the bad news is, as our brains move more into a state of distress, we become more close-minded.
Yeah.
We seek things we can control. We seek ways of making ourselves more comfortable. And one of the ways we get more comfortable is by being right over others. Our brains love self-righteousness. We get this dopamine reward by saying, those bleeping bleepers, they're wrong and I'm right. Yeah. Like that, there's something that feels good about that. And when we are not feeling good, when we're kind of like the earth seems to be shaking and we're seeking out some kind of certainty, that moral high ground, or that false moral high ground anyway, there's an illusion there of strength. There's an illusion of control. And I think it's one of the reasons why we see so much polarization in the world right now, is this basic neurobiology of threat. And as we go into higher levels of this escalated threat, we're becoming desperate for some way to to soothe ourselves.
Yeah.
And there are better ways, but that's kind of the automatic, that tribalism is an automatic built-in ancient process that that we fall into. And unfortunately, there are many elected officials and businesses that seek to use that tribalism as a lever to get people on their side by getting them against others.
You know, it's interesting. So part of the focus of the new book is just to show, you know, how many bridge building initiatives worldwide are going on. They're in the faith-based community, in the secular community. But it's really interesting to me that it's not easy to find reports on all these bridge building initiatives. You know, it starts with us. There's Bridge USA. There are all these. There's in the religious world. There's receptive ecumenism, which is trying to get different denominations to learn from each other. But it just doesn't seem that this stuff is really reported in the mainstream media. So what I'm hoping to do through people that are leaders like yourself is to really reflect that there are good things happening in the world, and people are choosing tribes that are not angry and just trying to tear each other apart. They're out there. You've just got to go look for them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm bringing it back to business. You think, okay, well, what do I want? I'm going to go work for this place. I'm going to go give them my lifeblood. And what do I want? You know, I don't want a place that's like stridently like dividing.
Yeah.
I want to build something up. I want to contribute. Now, of course, there are people who want to tear down, but I just don't think that's the majority.
No, well, it's interesting. Have you? So at the Super Bowl, there's this new ad campaign called "Jesus, He Gets Us, He Gets All of Us," and so it's very inclusive and it's sort of humanizing Jesus. But it was interesting after these two ads aired, you know, during the Super Bowl, the far left took them apart and the far right took them apart because the far right saying, you know, it said that Jesus is a refugee. Well, he was not a refugee. And then the far left saying, I don't think Jesus would pay millions of dollars to do a Super Bowl commercial. But it's interesting. I think when people start to strike that chord in the middle, it ends up inflaming the extremes on either side. I have a theory because I think it's kind of, if people come to the middle and work together, it's a threat to the extremes in the media and politics.
Yeah. I have a friend I want to introduce you to. She is a diversity strategist, and she has worked in large companies most of her career. And one of the things, her name is Princess Ayer Stewart, and one of the things Princess says is, power doesn't concede itself.
No.
And there is power in those extremist perspectives. Yeah. And when you start saying, well, let's, and you know, sadly, we've seen throughout history that bridge builders are often shot by somebody.
Yeah.
When you start saying, you know what, actually, there's this huge common ground. Actually, we can really work together in a way we don't need to alienate each other. The people who have a vested interest in doing that alienation, they now have a vested interest in telling you you're wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that there's it's a very problematic reaction that in some ways extremists are more similar to each other.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know, my belief is that there's that we are all connected.
Yeah.
And there have been moments in my life when I could feel it.
Yep.
And I think that when, from a leadership perspective, when we grow the skills of emotional intelligence, we are better at feeling that connection.
Absolutely.
One of my studies looked at what happened when people developed emotional intelligence and how did that change them. And one of the interesting findings was that people reported becoming, down the road, more accepting of who they really are.
Mm-hmm.
And that as they became more accepting of who they really are, they also became more accepting of who other people really were. And that authenticity, I mean, talk about bridge building,
Yeah.
right? When the real me, when I can accept and value the real me, and that opens up a door for me to say, like, I really want to connect with the real you, and you feel that, there's an incredible strength of relationship that builds.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful thing. Well, our good friend Dov Barron, who I often reference on the show, he talks about, acceptance versus fitting in.
Mm.
And he said sort of it's not the same thing. That fitting in, he compares it to, you find a new outfit that you just love, a new suit for guys, a new dress for, like, but you have a closet packed full of stuff. And so you get this new great garment and you stick it in the closet packed full of stuff and it gets all wrinkly and all messed up. And so you fit it in, but it's not serving the purpose. But whereas if you're accepted, that's more important than fitting in. And he said he thinks people confuse the two.
So there's a term in my work about emotional labor.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of this term was popularized in the 70s or before in the feminist movement. It was talking about how there was certain kinds of work that people have in female oriented roles typically have more of this work that they're doing. And by the way, new research in just the last couple of years says the same is true for senior executives.
Yeah.
Senior executive women are more often tasked with mentoring. They're more often tasked with negotiating complex relational challenges. They're more often tasked with kind of supporting these emotional dynamics. And I think that's a deep and historic challenge for us. But the point is this emotional labor, we're all working.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, you and I, there's some amount of cognitive labor we're doing, like trying to think about, our questions and answers. And there's some amount of emotional labor we're doing.
Yeah.
This is a pretty natural, easy conversation for me. I don't feel like I'm putting out a lot of emotional effort, but there's some, right? Because I know we're being recorded. I know people are listening. And I want to come across in a particular way. So there's emotional labor going on. Fitting in is a lot of emotional labor.
Yep.
Protecting yourself is a lot of emotional labor. Coming into a workplace or a community and not being really sure if the people around you want you there, that's a lot of emotional labor. As well as other kinds of labor, just the labor of protection. I'm sure you've heard this thing about, you ask a room full of guys, what do you have to do to prepare yourself to go out to get a coffee so that you'll be safe? And most white guys, like, nothing, and you ask a group of women the same thing, and there's this whole litany of labor that they're doing. So if we think about it from the perspective of an organization and people's energy, and you say how much of people's energy is going into the work, and how much of the people's energy is going into fitting in, protecting themselves, covering themselves, trying to figure out, their exit path, trying to figure out who has their back and who doesn't, like negotiating the sort of treacherous waters of typical organizational culture. Like, that is a ton of energy that's being wasted.
Well, it's interesting. I did a podcast with a young lady, Heather Parody, who is a millennial rock star recently. But she said, we were talking about Starts With Us, that I serve as a founding partner of, but it's founded with the 3 C's. If we can all treat each other with curiosity, compassion, and the courage to have the difficult conversations, how much better is the world going to be? But she said, well, what's the value in that to a business? I said, if you are a CEO and you commit to treating your employees with curiosity, compassion, and courage, and you model that behavior for them and expect them the same, look at what type of a culture you would build, particularly now that when people do call it cancel culture, call it what you want, but there are people that go into work and are concerned that if they express the wrong view, it's going to impact their job. So if you have an organization that's built around that compassion, curiosity, and courage, and the CEO is willing, the leader is willing to model it, it creates a culture that I think people are looking for, that type of culture these days.
Yeah. So we measure organizational climate.
Yep.
And one of the things we measure is trust. And what we've seen is there's a massive correlation between trust and performance. And trust is an emotion, right? It's something we feel. And that, I think, comes into play with what you're talking about, the kind of leadership where there's like a genuine curiosity and people are open and they care about each other and they're supporting each other and they're there for a reason. I think fundamentally, when we feel like I'm working with a group of people, we're doing something that matters, we're here for a reason, we're doing this together, that unleashes energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we went into the pandemic, one of the observations I made was as a leader, if you don't focus on being a trusted leader to those that you serve before a crisis hits, good luck becoming a trusted leader after a crisis has hit.
Yeah. I mean, this last few years has been intensely painful for many, many, many people. And the current economic conditions are complicated. I think we've so much uncertainty kind of weighing us down. It's pretty easy to lead when everything's going north. I remember being in Dubai around 2010 and 2012, and the tourist industry is just skyrocketing. Hotels could have really poor leadership and get 85-90% occupancy. Right? And that's unheard of in the world in the hotel business. Times like this that we're in now, we get to find out whether you're really a leader worth following.
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. In my first book, I wrote about this, about being mayor during the Great Recession, and talked about keeping your cool and your composure. And I compared it to, if I'm on an airplane and the airplane hits turbulence and the flight attendant does not look nervous, is calm, I'm going to be calm.
Yeah.
But if we hit turbulence and I look a flight attendant in the eyes and they look nervous, it's going to generally freak me out.
Yes.
So I think that's, to be a trusted and composed leader during difficult times, but you need to build that trust and maintain that composure before the crisis hits.
Yeah. I mean, I guess historically we look at some people like Winston Churchill, who, by what I've read, was sort of an okay leader before the Great War. And then really the crisis shaped him into becoming a really strong leader. So I think there is hope for those of us who have maybe not done the work that we needed to do beforehand, but it sure is easier if you come into crisis with a high level of trust. It's going to make it a lot easier to navigate that storm.
Well, I'll tell you, as we sort of get towards the end here, Zelensky, to me, that's he reminds me of Churchill in that I don't know, he was an actor, a comedian and everything. I don't know that people expected him to be the leader he's turned out to be.
Yeah.
But I'm hopeful, and I always talk about modeling, and I always focused on that when I was in office. I'm like, I want to be a mayor that kids can look up to and be proud of.
Yeah.
But for kids around the world to have an example of a government leader like Zelensky in this crisis situation is a great thing. And I wish we'd see more of that type behavior from our own politicians in the United States, but we shall see.
Yes, we shall see. The bad news about emotional intelligence is that it is declining.
Yeah.
We're going to see in this year's report some more declines. And one of the good sides of that is that for leaders who really are bringing emotional intelligence forward, they're going to shine even more brightly.
Yeah.
They're going to have even more competitive advantage in their organizations. As an employer, when you look around as an employee and you say, well, there's, 10 organizations I could go work for, and this one has a really emotionally intelligent culture,
Yep.
that feels better. I want to be there. Like that differentiator, the power of that differentiator is going to grow even more. So I think, in some way, the scarcity makes this more valuable, but I sure wish we didn't need that.
I agree. Well, as we get to then, there's a question I always like to ask my guests, and I can't believe I've actually made it through this with my voice in this shape. So there's hope for us all. But on a daily basis, what puts a smile on your face and brings joy to your heart?
Well, if I can give two answers. The first is, I think for most of my life, I felt like an outsider. I felt like, I remember just viscerally being in high school and kind of like looking at other people seeming like they were really having fun and kind of wondering like, why am I not in that group? In the work that I do now, I get to join meetings almost every day with people from around the world. And seeing people connecting and seeing people from across cultures and across continents and across religions and across traditions and across belief systems and as diverse as it's possible to be in the world is the Zoom meetings that I hang out in. And seeing people connect with each other and feel that sense of connectedness, that lights me up. And that makes me have this sense of being part of. And then the other thing is very simple. I live in a really beautiful place. And I make it a point, doesn't matter what the weather is, it's that day's weather. It doesn't matter, if the flowers are blooming or not. Today, the daffodils are up and it's just starting to feel like springtime here. But every day I make a point to just notice something in the natural world.
Yeah.
And I there's a lot of research now that supports this, that this noticing fuels a feeling that's called awe. And that feeling of awe, which is like the majesty of creation. If we can just touch that sense of majesty a little bit each day, it strengthens us.
I totally agree with you. That, I might not have put it that eloquently, but that kind of gets to the heart of why I do what I do. But Joshua, thank you for being an awesome guest, and I'd love to have you back as well. And thank you for all that you contribute in this world.
I am so grateful, Deke, and keep on building those bridges and shining lights on those bridges.
Will do, brother. That's all the time we've got. Dropping the mic, and we are out. Hey, guys, thanks for listening to or watching the Changemaker podcast today. Greatly appreciate it. If you're listening and you want to see the video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at Deke Copenhaver. That's pretty easy to remember, I would think. But really, we also want to remind you to like, subscribe, rate across all platforms, download. And if you're looking for a coach, a speaker, or anything, you know where to find me. Just email me at dekecopenhaver.com. And thanks so much for listening.